So, good morning, everyone, those who are here in the room and those who join us online. A Genocide Awareness Week 2023. I'm Abigail Samuelson. I'm a Regents Professor of History here in Shippers. I'm also earning a Marion Professor of Modern Judaism and the Director of Jewish Studies at ASU. It is my honor to introduce our first speaker for this conference, for this Genocide Awareness Week, is Marion Weinzweig, who is one of the youngest living witnesses of the horrors of the Holocaust. Yesterday, the Jewish community in Phoenix commemorated Yom Shoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, which was also, we should remind ourselves, the 80th year of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Marion participated, and her daughter also participated in the event, in the ceremony, and Marion lit one of the candles in memory of the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. Marion was born in Poland on January 3rd, 1941, a year after Germany invaded her town. Her given name was Manja Steinman, and she was just 18 months old when her young parents, they were in their 20s, realized that the only way to save her life was to hide her as a non-Jew with a non-Jewish family. The wife of a Polish landowner agreed to hide basically a baby at the time until it was safe to return her. Right? Very quickly, it became very unsafe to harbor her, even though she was given a Polish name. But that was not enough to hide the fact that this is a Jewish child that is being hidden here. So what was done was she was left, literally, I understand, at the door of a convent, and that's how she survived the war, how she survived the Holocaust, being raised as a Catholic, at least the appearance of a Catholic. Marion's mother and most of her extended family were sent to Treblinka, where they were murdered. Marion's father was a slave laborer in Stavovitz, and he was taken first to Auschwitz and then finally ended up in Buchenwald. Marion's father survived and was liberated on April 11, 1945. And we'll hear how you and your father got back together. It's a heroic story, a very tragic story. That because right after the Holocaust, as we will hear, they had to survive through several of the pogroms in the Russian sector of Poland. So they managed to do all that, immigrated to Canada in 1948, and their survival is a story of courage, resilience, and remarkable inner strength. So this year, our theme is the genocide, refugees, and diaspora. And it's very appropriate that Marion will be our first speaker to teach us the story of displacement, resilience, and rebuilding. So, Marion, please.
Thank you so much for introducing me. And you told so much of my story. There's very much more to say, but I'm really honored to be here at the Genocide Awareness Week, and I want to thank you so much for inviting me. Now, the word genocide was coined in 1944 by a Polish Jewish lawyer. His name was Raphael Lemkin, and he wanted to describe the systematic murders of Jews during the Holocaust. So what he did was he combined geno from the Greek word for race with psi, the Latin word for killing. Unfortunately, Jew hatred is still very much with us, almost to the levels of 1938 and on the rise. So we must learn about the Holocaust genocide in order to arm ourselves with knowledge and history so that it is not repeated. Excuse me, I have to get my water. So I drink a lot. So the Germans invaded Poland in September of 1939, and it was the very first country that they captured. 2/3 of the population of our town was Jewish, and when the Germans first entered, they set fire to the marketplace, and all the houses around it where mostly Jews lived. After that, 500 Jewish men were taken away, and they were never seen again. Then all Jewish businesses were seized by the Germans. All of our civil liberties were taken away. All students were thrown out from secular schools. And then white armbands and blue stars of David had to be worn. You can see my father holding me, and he's wearing his Star of David. And then you could be shot if you were caught without your armband. So this is what I was born into. I was born in Patow, Poland in January of 1941, and us Jews called it Acht. That's how I refer to it all the time, as Acht. Now my parents didn't register by birth, and even though it was mandatory for all Jews to register, there, I did it. It was mandatory for all Jews to register. Of course, that's Polish, so you don't understand it, because 2 months later, the Germans found out about me, and then, you know, they made my father go to City Hall to register me, and then he had to write a big long lie as to why it took him so long. But we know why, because he really didn't want to register me. So my name was Fanny Steinman, and I'm one of only 2 small children that survived from Acht. Now, 3 months after I was born, a ghetto opened in Acht, and Jews were forced to live there. So my father, he served in the Polish army in 1933. You know, Jews had lived in Acht since the early 1600s. Now my mother's home was in Lublin. It was the 3rd largest city in Poland, with 45,000 Jews living there. And of course, she moved out after she married my father in April of 1940. And that's the way there. And 9 months later, I was born. And I'm sure that the very last thing that my parents wanted at this precarious time was to bring a life into the world. By the way, the only person that's alive in that picture is my father, who's second from your left. That's my mother. She was pregnant with me. The only language was ever spoken in our home was always Yiddish, but from the moment that I was born, no Yiddish was ever spoken again, only Polish in front of me. And the reason for this was because my family felt that we might have to hide me as a Christian if things got really bad. And if I couldn't understand Yiddish, then I wouldn't give myself away. So the ghetto, that's the side of the Polish ghetto. And down there it says what the Polish, no, actually the German words are. The ghetto held over 7,200 Jews, and it occupied, it was horrific. It occupied only 2 to 3 city blocks of housing and a few of the alleyways. And because of the horrible overcrowding, the starvation, unspeakable sanitary conditions, there was a horrific outbreak of typhus in the ghetto, and people were just dying like flies. And on top of that, Jews were terrorized, and it became very demoralized because they were slaves, and they were cleaning the streets, and they were building roads and working in rock quarries, and then if you worked too slow, the guards would whip you. And you know, it didn't matter if you were a doctor, a lawyer, a shoemaker, everybody did the same work. And then every single night, you heard shooting coming from the Jewish cemetery. And people were just picked up randomly, those who disobeyed curfews for one. And then they saw old people, they saw young children, or people that looked sickly. They were gathered throughout the day, and at night they were taken to the Jewish cemetery and killed. Some of the pictures I've taken myself on my trips to Europe, and I'm always thinking about the Holocaust. So this is WWII. And in January 1942, 50 very high-ranking men held a conference at WWII, which is a suburb of Berlin. And that was to implement their final solution. And their strategy, the agenda was to strategize how to most efficiently murder the entire Jewish people. Would you believe that it was passed in an hour and a half? And then after that, they enjoyed lunch. And here's to my children that I took with me at that time, having lunch in WWII. You can see the backyard, how gorgeous. Anyways, what's interesting to note is that 10 of the 50 participants had attended university, so they weren't stupid. 8 of them had even been awarded academic doctorate degrees, and the majority of them were lawyers and some judges. So very, very scary. So after the WWII conference, 3 extermination camps, which were codenamed Operation Reinhardt, were constructed. And they were, the first one was Belzec, and then Sobibor and Treblinka. Now the plan was to murder all Jews that were living in the general government, which was 1/3 of all of Poland in the center of the country. And that's where 1,500,000 Jews lived. And unfortunately, that was where most of my family lived, where all of my family lived. Now, I'm sure that you're all very smart, so you know the difference. People say camps, but there was extermination camps and concentration camps. And there's a big difference, because with the concentration camps, then you had a chance to live if the Germans thought that you would be useful as a slave. But the sole purpose of extermination camps was to kill Jews on an industrial scale. And that's what those 3 camps were. And in mid-March of 1942, they murdered most of the Jews from Lublin and Belzec. My mother, she was, like I told you, was born in Lublin, and all of her family, my grandmother, great-grandmother, my mother's little brother, he wasn't even bar mitzvah yet, he's at the far right top. And my mother there's in the middle. And her 2 sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, everybody was murdered in Belzec that March. Now, 6 months later, rumors started that the Jews were going to be sent east. And there were several men who had escaped from killing centers in the east. And they came through telling horror stories of the atrocities there. And then our ghetto was just overflowing with Jews, because the Germans brought them in from as far away as Vienna. And so my father and my grandfather, they were wheat and flour merchants in Abt. And they had very good relations with some of the Polish landowners. So they asked this landowner by the name of Repolewska, and they dealt with him often. He would take me until it was safe to be returned back to them. And they agreed. So the next day, my parents sat me out in the ghetto. This was probably no more than about 2 months. 2 months or so before they started there, because my father's already wearing a coat. So it's close to the time. Anyways, they agreed. So the next day, like I told you, my parents left me out of the ghetto to the beach area where the Repolewska's carriage driver waited. And his name was Jan. And my father took me up to the carriage while my mother stood back crying. And that was the last time. So after I was given away, my father and his brother and wife, they were looking for ways to save themselves because the three, first of all, the three of them stuck out of the ghetto and they went to the city of Starkovitz, where my aunt had come from. That was her home. And they knew there was a slave labor camp there that was a munitions factory. And it's hard to fathom, but if you were a slave, then you were of some use to the Germans, so you actually had a chance to stay alive. So, and then my mother was very depressed because think of it, here she knew that all her family was dead, and then now she had to give up her little girl, and she didn't want to run with my father. She wanted to stay back with his parents. But he told her that that as soon as he finds a safe place that he thinks will be better, that he will call her and find a way to have her join him. But when he called to speak to her, the town telephone operator said that out was Judenrein, which means that it was clean of Jews. So on October the 20th of 1942, and it was just before daybreak, Germans, Ukrainians, and Polish police, they surrounded our ghetto and they rounded up all Jews. And of course, those that resisted were just shot up. And it was total mayhem. Now, as a side note, this isn't part of my presentation, but I just want to mention that if I said this in Poland, about Polish police, or even Poles in general, do you know that I would be fined and maybe even arrested because of new laws that criminalize speech that holds any Poles responsible for Jewish crimes during the Holocaust? Poland, unfortunately, is rewriting Holocaust history, and please, we must study that as well, because it's horrific what's going on now in Poland as far as the government is concerned and what they're printing. So back down, can you imagine Jews living in up since the 16th century, and it took the Germans only 3 days to get rid of every single Jew. I was there in October, just this past October, with two of my children. That's me and my two kids, and we were invited to a commemoration. It was the 80th anniversary of when the Jews were taken to their death. And I was the only survivor there, and I was also the only one who was born enough. And they were forced to march 5 abreast. Can you imagine 6,700 people marching 5 abreast? No, just horrific, because we didn't march that. Not all 70 kilometers, but the last kilometer we marched to Juzice, to the station. And so German soldiers announced that they were simply going to a transit camp before being sent on to a new life in Eastern Europe. And in Juzice, they were loaded into cattle cars to Treblinka, and those are the tracks. And 120 people were packed into each boxcar with 1 bucket for waste. And in Treblinka, the deception was so elaborate. There, when I was there, not this past time, but the time before, they have a museum there, and they had this big table with a huge model of Treblinka, because of course it was all destroyed, and I took pictures. But you could see where the train station was, and I sort of drew everything and read how it happened. But so like a big train station, I said, was erected, and it even had a ticket counter and a huge clock. And then after that, they had 2 long barracks that were side by side. You could see them there. And one was for women and children, and the other one was for men. And then everybody was ordered, of course, to undress for delousing showers, and their hair was short enough. And hair was a very, very important commodity because it was used to make fabric as well as upholstery. So then, whatever the Germans hadn't gotten already, they had them hand over anything else that they had, like valuables and documents, and you had to hand them to the guards before you were exited to the showers. And then, yeah, you can't see, but they walked along this fenced off path with flowers planted all along the way. It was a very nice, looked very, very lovely, towards this big building with a huge star of David on top of the building, to make the building look like an old-fashioned synagogue. But of course, it wasn't the shower; it was the entrance to the large gas chamber. And once they got you close by, you started hesitating. Then the guards would just whip you with whips and to make you move along, and you're just packed in like sardines and burdened with carbon monoxide, bundled into the chamber, and then you were cremated in the pits. And from the time that you got off the train until you were no more was 2 hours. It's actually less. And I guess you could say that I'm fixated on Treblinka because I truly believe that that's where I should be. My mother was murdered there at the age of 25, together with most of my father's family, my grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and like I said before, I was supposed to be with them, but I am with you today through the unselfishness of my parents giving me away. What you see on the screen are 17,000 stones commemorating the 900,000 victims whose final resting place is here. 216 of those stones bear the names of the cities and towns from which the Jews were transported here. Would you believe they brought them in from as far away as Greece? So I went into hiding no more than 3 weeks before my mother was murdered. And the Repolewskis gave me a Polish name. I became Marysia Repolewska, and they told their neighbors that I was in East just visiting for a little while. And back then there was bounty on Jewish heads, and if you reported a Jew, then the Germans would reward you. So when I didn't leave after a little while, the neighbors reported me. And one morning, there was a knock on the door, and it was the Gestapo. And it actually came to interrogate me. So they didn't have any problems checking out Jewish boys because all they did was make them lower their pants, and all Jewish boys are circumcised, so it was a complete no-brainer. But of course, with girls, it was different. By the way, that's why more girls survived than boys during the Holocaust. But the Gestapo was very well trained in speaking Yiddish, and they tried to trip me up by speaking Yiddish to me, figuring that they'd be able to tell by look of recognition in my eyes, my facial expression, if I understood. But I was totally blank. I only understood Polish, and so they left to check me out further. But the Repolewskis got very, very scared after that incident because, they could have been shot for harboring a Jew. So they told Jan, their driver, to just put me in the buggy, and he had a horse in a buggy, and just dropped me off in another town where I couldn't be traced to them. So he drove through several towns, and then he saw a convent near the city of Clementon. So he put me in a big ditch at the side, a really deep ditch at the side of the road on the right-hand side, and then he took off. And I was I was very scared. I was screaming and crying. But what he did was he was a good guy. He drove up to the convent, rang the bell, and when the night came out, he just told him that he heard noises coming from the ditch. It sounded like it could be human, and they should come and check it out. So when they came to check it out, there I was screaming and crying, and they thought that I was an abandoned Christian waif. So they took me in. Now, okay, so I'm looking at this because they gave this to me, and I'm just trying to figure out what I should be pressing. Now, I told you that, okay, so here's me in the convent, and I'm that little thing in the carriage at the bottom to the left. And I told you the Jews were forced on the death march from Acht on October the 20th. Would you believe that only 10 days later, on October the 30th, the Jews from Clementon, where I was placed, were taken to Treblinka. Now, I was the littlest in that convent of all girls, and my memories of it certainly aren't very pleasant. It was a very, very cold place and very, very strict. You don't want to be in a Polish convent. And of course, it was very religious, but of course, you expect that. And I was terribly hungry. I was always starving. And our barracks outside of the convent were close to the road. It was a very small barrack. And inside that barrack, our beds were so close together that it was more like sandwiches that in order to get in or out of bed, you had to climb in towards it and also climb out. Then every single morning we would go across the street to the church and do little chores and we pray there. And the church was also, to me, was very, very dark and scary. And I pretty well looked after myself. For some reason, I was when I go into the confessional, even now when I go back there, I cringe because I remember having to go to confessional. The life of me, I don't know why. And I became like a chameleon, just blending into all the nooks and the crevices. I tried not to make noises because I sure didn't feel safe. I hardly ever cried. And I was always trying to be very, very pleasing. But to tell you the truth, I was so alone. You know, I had no one to share my fears with, no one to touch you, nobody, you know, to hug me. But after a time, I was baptized, and I eventually became a fervent Catholic. I think the reason for this was because I believed that being a Christian was safe. So years later, when the Germans started retreating, somehow they bombed our convent, and the nuns there still don't understand why. We don't know why. And my barrack that I was sleeping in took a direct hit. It was very, very late at night, and so the nuns rushed in, and they what they did was they made us run out to the statue. In this big courtyard of the Virgin Mary. It's a huge, huge courtyard. You know, it doesn't look so big anymore, but that was the Virgin Mary in the courtyard. And we had to kneel down and pray to her to save us. So think about it, horrible noises and fire all around us, and we're kneeling and praying. And then I just jumped up and I started running. And I certainly remember this, and in my nightmares, I still remember running all alone and tripping over bodies, and I don't know if people were alive or dead, and darkness and fire all around me. I just ran and ran until I fell asleep from exhaustion in a field at the side of the road. And I really remember being all alone and very scared. And then we had a harrowing time, which I won't go into. But the convent didn't reopen because the children's barrack was totally wrecked. And then eventually, after a few days, I was placed in a convent in another town, in the town of WWII. Now, Starkovitz, the slave labor camp that my father toiled in, was a very, very sadistic place. And as the workers got weak or sick, but they were just murdered off, and a fresh batch of Jews were brought in. But eventually, the munitions factory there closed, and the slaves were sent on the death march to Auschwitz. So my father became A19671. That was his number, and that was his name. And for those of you that don't know much about Auschwitz, it was like a big camp divided into three very large camps and many sub-camps. And I took all these pictures the last time I was there, I think, or the time before. So my father and my uncle, they were slaves at the WWII part of Auschwitz. It was Auschwitz III, doing back-breaking work for IG Farben, who produced a synthetic rubber from corn. And you might know these names, Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel. They worked in Auschwitz along with my father. Now, German industries had built factories in Auschwitz, such as Krupp's, BMW, Bayer, Siemens, and I'm just naming very few. And these kinds of corporations paid the SS a few Reichmarks per day. So unskilled labor went for 3 Reichmarks a day. Skilled labor was 4. And children that got 1.5. And back then, 2.5 Reichmarks equaled $1. And so it was such a win-win situation for these large corporations, as well as the German army. They got some money in their coffers, and the industries became billionaires and are still very much thriving today. There's a book out, it's called Nazi Billionaires. It's very good. I just finished reading it, if anybody's interested. So my son looking at the destroyed buildings, but as the Russians were approaching at the end of 1944, the Germans wanted to destroy the evidence of their atrocities. So they destroyed most of the crematoriums. And then they forced their healthy workers on death marches back into Germany to be used for slave labor. So those that couldn't walk anymore were shot along the way. It was January the 17th of 1945 when my father and uncle were marched in freezing weather many miles, and then they were put on cattle cars to Buchenwald. And there they were interned in a horse stable that was built for 50 horses. Would you believe that 1,000 to 2,000 people were put into each of these stables? It's even hard for me to understand it. I've gone to Buchenwald. Anyways, in late spring of 1945, Buchenwald was liberated by, thank God, the United States Army. Now my father, for all intents and purposes, he was a dabber, and he went back to Abt to find my mother and his family. He didn't know that everybody was dead, which of course they were. And then he started looking for me, and he eventually tracked me down to that second convent. Knocked on the door, nuts opened the door. They refused to give me back. To them, I was a perfect Catholic child. And I'll tell you the truth, by now, I would be the Mother Superior. So they told them that they had no Jewish children there. They never had any Jewish children there, but he persisted, and he wouldn't leave. And the nuns were afraid that he would make a ruckus and bring the Russians around. Russia was our ally at the time, and they had liberated Poland. And I have very good feelings about the Russians because at that time they were very sympathetic towards the survivors, but certainly not the Poles. So the nuns let him in, and he lined up all the little girls with their backs to him, and if you can believe, and our faces to the wall. And he told, they told him that he could pick me up, he could have me. Well, first of all, the last time he had seen me, I was a year and 9 months, a year and 3 quarters. And now I'm 5 years old, but he kept looking at little girls' legs. And luckily, I was born with a very large birthmark on the inside of my left leg, which I believe that's how he recognized me. Anyways, they told him, just a side note, and I wasn't going to say, but for many years until my first granddaughter was born, her name was Samantha, I always wondered, was I the real Meidersteimer, or was I really a Catholic girl? And the real Meidersteimer was at the convent. So when my granddaughter was born, take a look at her. This whole area there was my father, and so that's when I started believing that it was really me. But anyways, they told him that he had to pay them 5,000 zlotys for my release. And I knew full well that he had absolutely nothing. He'd gone through years of unspeakable horror, and but he had no choice. He didn't have the money, and he had to leave. But by this time, different agencies had set up help centers for the refugees, and one could hopefully find a loved one who was alive, and or request other kinds of help. And so my father begged for 5,000 zlotys everywhere he went, I guess, to get me out. And he somehow got his 5,000 zlotys. I really, there. That's my father's writing. And you can tell by the red that it was approved. I'll also show you the translation of it. But I think he got his money. I believe he got his money from the Detroit Distribution Committee, and then he went back to get me. Now, after the money exchange, and they had no choice, they had to give me back. So the man brings me out, and I took one look at my father, and I became totally hysterical. I don't know how it happened, but somehow I'd been indoctrinated. The Jews were very evil, and that was among other things that I'm not even going to talk about. And I was an avid Christian, and for some reason, I don't understand, I had become a ferocious Jew hater. Crazy, but I had no choice, I had to go with him. So he takes me to Lodz, and Lodz was a big city in Poland also, and he found 2 of his younger sisters who had been in minor slave labor camps alive there. And we all lived together. And then every single night I would go into a corner of the room, and I'd cross myself and I'd pray to Jesus. To say the least, my family was not happy with me, because think about it, here they lost most of their loved ones and all of their properties, and their flesh and blood is a perfect anti-Semite. Well, soon they realized that we were not safe in Poland because anti-Semitic pogroms had started. Polish vigilante groups, they were beating up, and oftentimes even killing Jews were coming back from hiding, from concentration camps, from forests. And then on top of that, Poles feared that we're coming to take back our belongings and our properties. And, you know, you can't blame them. They don't want to give it back to us. So we had to flee in the middle of the night, you know, to avoid the roving pogroms. So after the Holocaust, there were thousands of Jewish survivors in Poland, as well as refugees who had returned there from hiding in the Soviet Union. So when anti-Semitism had reached its zenith, these Jews decided to move to Germany, to American-occupied zones where the American Army had set up displaced persons camps for the homeless. I just call them DP camps. And these camps were meant to be just temporary living quarters. So we made our way, well, you can see I was much younger then. The first time I went to Weert, we made our way to a DP camp in the town of Weert on the Donau. And that's about 15 kilometers away from Regensburg, and it's in Bavaria. And this was strictly a Jewish refugee camp, and the living conditions were pretty good. That's me there. And the American Army had thrown out a bunch of very high-ranking Germans out of their huge homes, and they set up a DP camp for us. It was like about 10 big houses in a row. And the reason that we wanted to go there was because my father's older brother, surviving brother, of course, was there with his wife, and as well as that's his wife next to me there, and her niece and her sister. On the balcony there, and there I am, there's my hand. And we were assigned to live at 207 Regensburg Strasse. And a lot of us lived in each house. And two people each shared a bedroom, and all of us shared the living room, the dining room, the bathroom, the kitchen. It was like a communal house. There were about 10 of them. And so my father and I, we shared a bedroom, but to tell you the truth, he was shell-shocked. He never came out of it, really. He was sort of lost in his own misery and was doing his own thing. I think the war actually just destroyed him. And I just wandered amongst all the refugees, and there were absolutely no children for me to play with because we were this small refugee camp that was totally Jewish. But anyways, I did a lot of things by myself. And I remember one day I was walking on a high wall that I wasn't supposed to be on that separated the houses from the orchards. And of course I was by myself. I fell off the wall into the orchard. I hurt myself pretty bad. And I don't know if that's when I broke my nose or if my nose was broken before that even. Again, read the bottom. Now, the large DP camps, they had schools and activities for children, but ours was a very small one, so we didn't have any because there was no child there. Because the whole DP camp that I was in held only 200 people, and most of the refugees in my camp had been sent on death marches into Germany or were in concentration camps there already. They stayed in Germany. And that is why we were there in the first place. And the survivors treated me like their little mascot, because to them I was a reaffirmation of life. And I just wandered amongst them as they were talking about all their horror stories. They didn't seem to understand that maybe this wasn't good for me. And I ate an awful lot of Spam because American soldiers gave us a lot of it. And then soon the survivors started marrying, and women became pregnant, and they started having babies. And one of those babies is a cousin that I have who lives in Toronto now. And of course, we didn't have a synagogue But some of the more learned Jews, they took over that task and they had us celebrating all of the Jewish holidays. And let me tell you, they really celebrated. And because I remember my first Passover, I guess it had to be in 1946. And there were a lot of us survivors at this Passover. And the adults read the Haggadah from cover to cover. Then after that, they sang every single song, and we didn't even get to eat till close to midnight. I was starving, and I was so bored, and I kept fidgeting. I remember to this day, and it was really not pleasant. In the mornings, the men would take a train into Regensburg. It was only about a 15-minute ride in order to trade. They traded things that the American Army had given them in order to make some money, and then they'd always return home back to Donut for dinner. And like I said, American soldiers gave us cigarettes, tins of food, nylons, and other things. And then the men would trade these items in Regensburg, in the city, for things that they could sell, like watches. And then the ladies, they would just primp and they try to make themselves pretty. They tried different hairdos and they would sew dresses from material that was given to us from, I don't know where, but we had material. Now, one thing that really sticks out in my mind to this day is that one day we're all in somebody's house. I don't know if it was in the house I lived in or others. And it was a whole bunch of women who were all yakking. They're all yakking away. And the men had gone off to Regensburg. And all of a sudden, the door opens, main door opens, and there's a guy there holding a gun on us. And I can't tell you how frightened we all were. He was speaking in a language that nobody understood. We didn't understand what the heck he was saying. And we're all really scared. But anyways, there was one brave lady who was in another part of the house, and she snuck out to the back door and she ran to get the police. Well, the police came in and they dragged out this guy who happened to be a drunken American soldier. But it's something that it has never left me. But when we went into town, we always went in groups because the German population wasn't exactly, they weren't thrilled to see us. And if I saw a church, I would break away from my group and I'd run in and I would pray. And someone always had to run after me and drag me out. And if I saw a nun on the street, I mean, I was in heaven and I ran after her and got down on my knees and tried to kiss the bottom of her veil. But to tell you the truth, we were always met with silence and hostility. And as a matter of fact, I took my daughter back there to Regensburg. I don't know, it had to be about 20 years ago. And would you believe we were met with the same hostility? I wish I had taken a picture of that woman and some of those people. They were really hostile to us. Anyways, just try to imagine how horrible it was for us because, first of all, we had no homes to go back to, unlike soldiers and also people from other countries, such as France, that took back their people. Poland was killing theirs. And we had no belongings, no birth certificates, no papers of any kind, hardly any money. And of course, most of our families were decimated. And we're all trying to get visas out of Europe to get out of there. But no country wanted us. No country wanted us. We even prayed of all the survivors. You could read at the bottom, it was when the state of Israel came into existence. That's in Bir Nagadona, where we're walking. Anyways, we lived in limbo in the DP camp for 3 years. And it was too difficult to get into the United States because of quotas. but eventually we managed to get a visa for Canada. And we made our way to Coxhaven and boarded our ship, which was the SS Scythia. It was on October the 1st of 1948. And of course, we were at the very bottom of the ship in steerage. And it had to take about 2 weeks to cross the Atlantic Ocean back then. And I was so sick, all I did for those 2 weeks was just throw up. Then we got off the ship in Quebec City, and it was a different world. People were there from different organizations, probably charities, and they were offering help for the survivors. And one person gave me an orange, and I'd never seen one before. Then someone else gave me a chocolate bar, and I just couldn't believe my good luck. I just kept hoarding everything. And then eventually we were put on a train to Toronto. And there we were met by cousins who, of course, they were born in Toronto. They were very different, but they offered us hospitality for a couple of weeks until my father got a job. And his first job was in a factory sweatshop sewing pants. So I was 8.5 years old and I put into kindergarten. Can you imagine how horrible that was for me to begin with? I was completely illiterate. I didn't speak a word of English. And I had not had one day of schooling either, except for Polish prayers. And back then, of course, it didn't have translators for children like they do today in schools. But think about it. In life, I had a PhD. I spoke 3 languages. I'd gone through 3 name changes, but I was like a little animal. I was constantly hungry, hoarding food. And even though we had food then, I was still hoarding food. And I'll tell you something, I think I still hoard food because I live alone by myself, and yet I have freezer, 2 freezers, one outside, and my pantry, oh my God. And I don't eat that much. But anyways, then my father, he subleased a room in downtown Toronto. And it was a lousy existence. He couldn't look after me. So he put me into a foster home. Well, of course, that didn't work out. And I was placed into another couple of foster homes. And if you think of it, here I was a child who had lived such a tumultuous, horrific life that I just really couldn't fit in anywhere. But thankfully, my aunt and my uncle, who had gone through the war with my father, his brother and his wife, took me in to live with them when I was 9 years old. And I lived with them through adulthood. Now, several years ago, I hired an investigator in Poland. Several years ago, my gosh, it's more like 20 years ago. I'm 82 years old, I'm an old lady. So I hired an investigator in Poland to try to give me a childhood. I didn't have one, and I wanted one desperately. And so in the Ronald Water Jewish Archives in Warsaw was where he found the letter that my father had written begging for money to free me. And of course, did I know about this? No, because my father never talked to me to begin with, and he sure as heck never told me about that. And then the investigator left. He was dead by this time, so I couldn't even ask him about it. I would have loved to ask him. The investigator left inquiries at both convents, asking anyone that needed to contact him. So the carriage driver, again, used to pass by Clementov every so often, and he'd go visit them. And he was showing the inquiry, and he was so shocked because he was sure that I was dead. And he called, and I was really lucky enough to talk to him several times. And he brought me back to when he picked me up from up. And I asked him on the phone who brought me up and where was my mother. So that's how I found out that my father carried me. My mother had stood there crying. Then he told me about the Recolevska family. and he told me about leaving me in the ditch, screaming and crying, and while he drove away. Then an older girl, her mother had been the cook in the convent, and she kept in touch with the convent. She lived in Lodge now. And she was told about the inquiry when she called it, and she remembered me because I was so little. And she actually was the one that I got that picture from, that I actually got the picture of me in the convent shortly after I showed up there. And of course, I was able to call her in Lodge, and I recaptured my time in the convent. Then he also found, of course, some of the nuns who now are dead, but that they remembered me, and I corresponded with them. I visited them. Went back there. I even remembered where my barrack was, because he asked me, where's the barrack? And I looked around because it's totally just, there's nothing there anymore. And I pointed directly to where it was. And by the way, they still believe that that they told us the last time we were there that what happened, the bombing, was the second greatest miracle of all time to them. Of course, the first being Jesus, and the second, that all the children were saved. But best of all, I took my 3 children to Poland when I turned 70. And that was to pass on my life to them, because I just felt it was very important. And I hired a Polish guy to go with us. And he in turn found a city councilman from out to help us. 10 years before that, I tried to get information about myself and was told that there was absolutely no record of me. So this time we stormed City Hall and made them open up their books to us. And sure enough, my birth was registered in this big book there. And that's me when we waited to get the actual birth certificate. So at the age of 70, I found out first of all, my real birth date. I have an actual birth certificate, and it's absolutely crazy because I am 8 months younger than my father listed. I think he was more or less thinking about when he married my mother, and nobody ever thought, hey, this is strange. And I also found out my birth name, which was Miriam, and I like that a lot better than Marion, but so be it. So just a few thoughts that I want to leave you with, and that is that the Holocaust should be studied not only for the atrocities committed, but also how society could have allowed such an unimaginable genocide to occur in the 20th century. It just boggles my mind. Also, it was an unprecedented attempt to murder a whole people and extinguish their complete culture. And I just want you to remember that Germany was a democracy when Hitler took power. The Nazi Party used the electoral process of democracy to actually destroy democracy. Think about that. Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933, and only 5 months later, Germany became a dictatorship. So we have to understand how fragile the institutions that protect our rights and securities can be. And we should not take them for granted. I mean, that I would like to repeat about 10 times. Vote. And then we must speak up when we see signs of hatred or discrimination. And that comes from both the left and from the right, because anti-Semitism does not have a party. The Germans would never, ever have been able to murder over 6 million Jewish souls if there had been a public outcry against it. So I beg you to please learn from the atrocities of the past so we can prevent them from being repeated in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes, we've got, some
Okay,
way
few
we
minutes
can
while I
folks
change
that start here. Oh, you're good. Sure, you started. That's, we can also arrange for you step outside in the hallway, but we can spend a few minutes to take some questions here, so.
While I get this set up.
And yeah, while we're getting set up, sure.
Thank you for inviting me.
So any questions or comments?
Also, thank you very much for sharing your process. I have two questions. One is to Holocaust humanity for a bipartisan exchange of your humanity. And also the last question. I'm from Myanmar and back home in Myanmar, unfortunately another genocide is going on. So as a survivor, what would be your message to those who are going through similar experiences? Question.
That would take a good half hour to answer that. But as far as the Holocaust is concerned, it's interesting because when I was young, I tried to steer away from it. Actually, like your people who wants to fight to freedom and not relate to it, and also be very embarrassed by it, and don't have to think it's just ridiculous. But that will happen also. They don't want to talk about it. But as we get older, they need help because it's coming back, and this is pretty well eventually as you get old, that is so very important to you. Sorry that I don't have time to answer your questions in yet. Yes.
I would imagine, thank you so much, that your relationship to Catholicism and Judaism is very complicated. How does that manifest for you at this point in your life?
But you know, I don't even understand how it happened that I became so fervent. Well, I think because of the state. And then the hatred of the Jews. And I guess it must have taken 3-4 years to be indoctrinated to that. And it took 3-4 years for me to get out of that. Eventually, I became total Jewish. I protect Judaism to my core. I stand for Israel, right or wrong. It's the country of my soul. What can I tell you? I became totally Jewish. Hey, I could probably be indoctrinated to something else now. Sorry.
I was wondering, what helped you to adjust? What was most helpful to you?
You know, unfortunately, I get sport, and I pretty well just I grew myself up. I don't know because I never had help, and I've never gone to a psychiatrist because I know guys that if I went and started talking to them, I'd want that the rest of my life. So I never had a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I just deal with everything myself. And I'm so fortunate. Look how lucky I am. I have 3 incredible children and 5 grandchildren that are just the most wonderful, wonderful people. One of my grandsons is right here now. And my daughter, I'm very lucky, I'm very blessed. And I'm 82 years old. Look how long I be dead, you know, that was 2 years old, and I'm still here.
Well, thank you, we're very.